Let me share with you 6 settled points of science to do with humans causing global warming. Here they are. Here's the first. The first is you can't look at modern climate change and say whether humans are causing it or not, except in the context of natural climate change. So there's got to be something unusual about either the magnitude or the rate of warming in the late 20th century. And it did warm for 25 years or so in the late 20th century. So there needs to be something special about that warming outside the range of natural variation. So we have to start with a slide to say, is the magnitude unusual? And we have to look at the natural variation. There it is. How long do you need? 3 years to the next election. You need 6 million years of context. So on the left here, 6 million years ago. On the right, today. This is a temperature in red of the Pacific Ocean collected from, or measured in a deep sea core from the bottom of the ocean. And here is today's temperature. Here's the scale, about 10 degrees up and down, arbitrary. And here's today's temperature. And the line across the diagram is today's temperature. So now the first obvious thing about context here is that between 6 million years ago and 3.5 million years ago, temperature was 2 to 3 degrees warmer than today. Well, hang on. We hear biologists every week telling us in the news media that if the temperature goes up 2 degrees, there's going to be a biodiversity crisis. How's that possible when nearly all the plants and animals on the planet are genetically pre-adapted because they evolved and lived during times when the temperature on average was 2 to 3 degrees warmer than today? That's the first thing you'd draw from this diagram. The second thing you would draw is that it's jigging up and down a lot. It's like a kid on, what's that, Ritalin? Or not on Ritalin, rather. It's always going up and down. In other words, climate changes. That's what climate does, naturally. It's not your SUV necessarily to cause it to change. Climate change, that phrase, think about it for a moment, is a tautology. It actually says the same thing twice. If I say to you something about climate, well, of course, that changes. So change is what climate does. And here it is, jigging up and down the whole time. In that context, over this period of time, it was warmer than today. But you can see 3.5 million years ago, it embarked on a long, steady decline into what we call Ice House Earth. And these are the great glaciations of the last million years or so, glaciations and interglaciations. So as this descended down here, the jigging and jogging gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and now here are these huge interglacial glacial fluctuations. If we look at the last warm period, we live in this warm period, but if we go to this one, 125,000 years ago, the temperature was 2 degrees or so warmer. It's 2 degrees warmer there than today. It's 5 degrees warmer than today there. So the first point, settled science. There is nothing unusual about the magnitude of warming in the late 20th century. Well, that's a context diagram, contextual diagram. Let's come now to the more immediate issue. What's happening right at the moment, or rather over the last couple of decades? Well, we didn't put satellites up in a routine way until 1979, and the first good weather satellites went up then. And satellites enable you to measure much more accurately the average global temperature of the planet than the little white boxes at all the meteorological stations with the thermometers inside. Nothing wrong with that data set in a sense. It goes back historically further, but nobody would start with that data set if they had this one. So from 1979, we have a truly accurate record of average global temperature. Here it is. And the question I'm asked by reporters is global warming happening, Bob? Now think about that. They don't actually mean that, do they? What they mean is dangerous global warming caused by human carbon dioxide emissions happening? That's what the question means to them. But to me, if I just listen to it in a logical, scientific way, is global warming happening? Well, of course, I'd say yes, it's always happening. Over a couple of decades or so, it'll always get a bit warmer or a bit cooler. So you have to be precise in your language, and this bedevils the whole public debate. Firstly, the sloppy use of language, and secondly, green propaganda language like dirty energy, for example. All that sort of stuff. Okay, so is warming happening then over the last couple of decades? Well, here's the temperature today in 2008. Here's the temperature in 1979. Warming happening? No, looked at that way, it's not. But we can see, can't we, that these few years up here are significantly warmer than these few years in here. So a scientist wouldn't look at dots on graphs. he or she would plot a line through them. Okay, well here's a line we can plot, or two lines, and we can say there was no change along this period of time, and there was no change along this period of time, but there was a step of 0.2 degrees warming across 1998. And what's this big warm spike in 1998? Anybody know? It was the biggest El Nino of the 20th century, strongest El Nino of the 20th century. Warming not just in Australia, but all over the world. And what happened across that big natural event was there was a shift in the climate system. And it shifted up to a slightly warmer mode, and these are actually El Nino-dominated years themselves. Now, that's a second equally possible interpretation of that set of data. Yes, there's been warming, but no, it's not a long-term trend. It's a step event across the 1998 El Nino. Well, there's a third way of looking at the data, and that's to say, well, this is all we've got, so we'll now plot a line through the whole data set, and that's what it looks like. These three alternative interpretations are equally plausible scientifically. There's no particular reason to favour one over the other, except that if you're going to argue, and the people that plot this line say, temperature's going up and carbon dioxide's going up, yes it is, 15% over that period of time, so of course it's the carbon dioxide that's causing the temperature increase. Now, as a scientist, I can't say that. All I can say is there's three possible interpretations of that data set. I'll explain it to you, and now you go away and think about it. Nobody can tell you which one's right, and two of them, compare the red dots or fit the two lines, two of them are inconsistent with the greenhouse warming hypothesis from carbon dioxide. One of them, if you fit a full trend line, is consistent with it. Let's just bear that in mind. Well, now, the second best data set on the planet for looking at temperature over the last few decades comes from weather balloons. And they started being let off around the world in 1958. And they let off at meteorological stations, airports, and the big white helium-filled balloons. They have an instrument package below them, and they ascend up through the atmosphere to, I think, something like 70,000 metres and explode. And all the way up, they're measuring the temperature, the humidity, and the wind direction and speed. So it's a very high-quality data set, but of course, it doesn't cover the whole globe. It's only, I think it's about 100 or 150 stations over the globe, whereas the satellites, because the globe's revolving underneath them, genuinely do traverse basically the whole globe. Nonetheless, good data set, and look here, from 1979 through to 2005, it matches this curve. There's a slight warming trend. Here's the big 98 El Nino, and these other bumps and up and down match these. That's a really important point, because these are collected from two different instrument sets by different groups of scientists. They're analysed in different ways, and you see they agree both in their overall trend and in the detail of the ups and downs. So that gives you as a scientist a great deal of confidence in these data sets. And we see it confirms this warming. But the problem with this warming is, what's the difference between weather and climate? Mark Twain got it beautifully. Climate is what you expect, and weather is what you get. Spot on. Now, scientists like to use something a bit more quantitative than that, so the meteorologists, and this is an arbitrary number, decided back in the mid-20th century that they would define climate as 30 years of average weather observations at a particular site. So for this town, we take the weather record and we take a 30-year period, and it goes up and down through the... We average that, and we have one point which says the climatic average temperature here is, let's say, 12.3 degrees or 15, whatever it is. It's of that order, Celsius. Okay, well, this is 29 degrees long, 29 years long. So how many climate data points does it represent? Not quite one. I'm not going to show you, because it has scientific defects, the full 150-year-long record that is the meteorological station temperature thermometer derived temperature curve that is normally the one used in the newspaper, but that is 150 years long. What's 30 years divided into 150? 5. So all we have, the meteorologists have, in terms of climate observations, is 5 data points. That graph I showed you of the 6 million years of Earth history has thousands of data points on it. That's real climate change. And they are trying to tell you and your governments that they should revolutionise the energy economy of the world on the basis of 5 data points. It's amazing stuff.